Hi, welcome to Neuroverse
A podcast hosted by Carolina
and Clara, where we discuss all matters from neuroscience to philosophy and beyond.
Today's episode is on the philosophy of machine learning, and to help us with it is a special guest, Alex Mussgnug. So Alex is doing a PhD at the University in Edinburgh in the epistemology of machine learning. So what is machine learning?
So we're going to jump right in.
Yeah.
I think that's a difficult question, and there are definitely a lot of definitions out there and a lot of different perspectives from which you can look at it. And a lot of them I'm not too happy with, actually. So a lot of people think of machine learning as closely associated with artificial intelligence. And while it's true, that often leads into anthropomorphizing metaphors and people immediately associating machine learning with some form of intelligence or something like that. And I think that's a bit off topic. How I like to think about it is just as building models automatically. So what I think machine learning does is just basically it builds a model automatically. So maybe if I want to continue a bit to make more sense out of this is that we in machine learning like to distinguish a learning algorithm and a model. So the learning algorithm is basically the thing that builds a model from data, and then we might use that model to predict something.
Could you give us an example?
Well, let's say you have text and you want to use sentiment analysis. So you have given text and want to predict whether that's more a positive or a negative text. So we would use that data and collect the text, and we would, in supervised learning at least, also have labels that say, okay, this text is a positive example, this case has more of negative emotions in it. And then we would use a learning algorithm that from this data, so from the text and from the labels that we have, constructs a model.
Mm-hmm.
And then we would use that model to make predictions if we give a new text. Okay. Does that make sense? So like can be understood analogous to like a programmer and a program.
Mm-hmm.
So like someone would code the program and that's the learning algorithm, and the finished program would be the model.
So how much does the learning algorithm affect what type of models can be produced? Basically, how much control does the person who makes this learning algorithm have over how the machine learns and works?
The key thing to look is the data that gets fed into the model rather than the specific algorithm or model that you choose. So what happens in a lot of machine learning papers is that you have a specific problem, and that problem is more or less defined by the data set you're having. So for example, if we stay with the sentiment text classification example, then the data set of the text examples and labels that you have is often much more important than the specific model or learning algorithm that you're choosing. So what gets done in a lot of machine learning papers is I have this problem, I have this data set, and I want to use that to predict a certain thing, and I employ a bunch of different models and I just see which one performs best. And that's how it usually gets done. And I've often heard that. I've never seen much data on whether that's actually true, but a lot of people would say that to get the best results, the data that you put in is much more important than the specific model that you choose.
Okay.
But so, and when it comes about machine learning in science, which is one of my main interests, I think it's just helpful if we want to think about what machine learning can do or is doing in science to maybe start by thinking about how models, traditional models, get used, for instance, in neuroscience. I think that's something you could tell me. Are there any like standard models that are employed in neuroscience, and for what kind of tasks do you use models in neuroscience? Because everything that gets done with traditional models to some extent might also get done with machine learning models.
Yeah. Before answering that, I wanted to say I read that a lot of what they call deep machine learning is based on neural networks. So it's based on the fact that in the brain you have layers of cells and that they communicate with each other by sending signals up and down, similar to top-down versus bottom-up processes. And in machine learning, apparently, it operates in a similar way in that it inputs data and mathematically it corrects any errors and it gets bumped up and down. So I think it's interesting, this overlap or like inspiration of neuroscience to machine learning.
I think it's really important to map the landscape of machine learning at this point.
Okay,
because,
yes, tell us.
and so machine learning includes a wide range of models that might get used. Those might be Gaussian process regression, support vector machines, tree-based regression models, but also neural networks. And neural networks is just one type of model that gets used in machine learning.
Oh, okay.
So now when these neural networks get more and more complex and more layers are added, that's when we usually like to speak of deep learning.
Okay.
So deep learning is really a subset of machine learning. And the way you put it, I think, is exactly how we should think about it. It's inspired by the functioning of the brain, and I think historically also it was inspired by it. But we shouldn't take that analogy too closely,
Okay.
because that can lead us astray.
Okay.
But you're right in that what we have in machine learning is maybe similar to what you call top-down, bottom-up, right? So we have a data input that gets processed through our system.
Yeah.
Out comes a prediction, and if that prediction is wrong, we back-propagate,
Yeah.
statistically speaking, and go back and correct layer by layer what might be changed so that next time this gets put in, we get the right solution out. So like this correcting mechanism, is that something that also happens in the brain?
Yes, that's pretty much predictive coding.
Oh.
Yeah. Which is where you input a visual stimuli. So like, the light hits the eye and the input travels up the visual cortex into the brain.
The top-down information interacts with the
Bottom-up information.
stimuli that's coming in, and then there's a predictive error, which is the difference between these types of information.
Yeah.
And the goal of changing the top-down information is to minimize the predictive error, because you can't change the bottom-up information as much as you can change the top-down information through cognitive processes. Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I think that's at least to some extent analogous to what gets done in machine learning. I'm more worried about when people make that association of the brain and a machine learning model, that we quickly get into quite weird claims of this being like super intelligent soon, or doing the same kind of things that human beings do. And I just think that is taking the metaphor the completely wrong way. Whereas what I propose is like thinking about this as just like a modeling exercise, is a much more pragmatic and I think mostly more accurate way of thinking about machine learning.
I'm really happy you said that, because I don't know a lot about machine learning at all, but I've always kind of been very apprehensive about like machine learning and artificial intelligence and comparing that to like human intelligence, and I feel like people make this leap too often. And also with like neural networks, which are called neural networks, but they're not really neural networks per se, like in the brain. They're artificial, and I think it's just like a small part of what the brain does do, and like you said, you put so well, it's inspired by how the brain works, but it isn't exactly.
Right, exactly. And we might be going a bit astray with this, but other interests of mine are in AI ethics. So like the kind of, and there's a lot of talk and buzz about the moral and ethical social problems that arise out of machine learning and artificial intelligence. And what gets done a lot is people make this kind of leap between machine learning and intelligence and the human brain, and are quick to talk about things about we need robot rights and we need to think about how we include AI as citizens in society. And those are not the pressing questions that we face. But the pressing questions that we face are much more mundane and can be answered with a much more pragmatic set of tools and ways of thinking.
So what are some pressing questions in AI ethics that you think are more relevant and that we should be trying to tackle?
Well, I think when it comes to machine learning, a really pressing question is how we handle the kind of automation that takes place and might take place. And that, maybe to tie it back to science, that is a question that also scientists or philosophers of science are debating nowadays. If we make use of these machine learning models more and more, and they get increasingly sophisticated and can do more and more things, where's the place for the human scientist? So maybe this is both an ethical and an epistemological question, because it includes societal changes in the labor market, but it also is interesting in that what is the human involvement in knowledge production if we're talking about science, if machine learning gets to be able to do more and more things, for instance.
But you see, this is why I was interested in like how much control does the machine have versus the human who's technically controlling the machine.
Oh, this is a good point, and we might go back to what I said about data, right? So if we think that data is really the critical aspect in a lot of machine learning applications, the question is, how does this data get produced more so than what does the model do, or which model might be the best tuned model for the task. So machine learning for me in a lot of ways, or thinking about the philosophy of machine learning, must include thinking about data and the philosophy of data, how data gets produced, because that is basically the building block of every machine learning model.
Yeah. So interesting you said we need to think about the kind of data that is being produced. Yeah, I think this is something we also talked a little bit with Lisa on our physics episode, and about how depending on the science that you use, I think that there are different ways of arriving either at the same data or like tackling similar questions but through different methods. In neuroscience, for example, I guess you can look at things from like an electrophysiology point of view and look at the synaptic inputs into cells, as well as from like a molecular point of view and looking at the proteins that are interacting in the neurons. And so you can look at it from the molecular point of view or the electrophysiology one.
And then ultimately we're always extracting information about behavior, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like how the brain works and how it results in these behavioral outputs. But the number of steps between those molecules and the electrical activity and the behavior is just insane. So
Yeah.
what does the data mean?
Yeah.
Basically.
Exactly. And like interpreting the data, not only I think using machine learning, but simpler things such as statistics and how we read the data or how we sort out the noisy data is really important to take into consideration. Yeah. An example of this would be, as I've mentioned before, spike sorting, where you record neurons extracellularly and you record millions of their spikes, and then you use algorithms, which it's completely arbitrary and up to which algorithm you're going to pick, a sorting algorithm that sorts out the data.
What does it sort the data for?
You get millions of spikes and you need to assess which of those are actually relevant and indicative of the activity happening. And so the algorithm sorts out noisy data so that you don't analyze every single spike, because that would take not only too much processing power but also too much of your time.
And also because the way you record this is you implant a electrode pretty much into a brain, so it actually records from multiple layers. And so you need to sort of use these algorithms to localize the activity to see where the neurons are, because the same neuron or a bunch of neurons can be picked up from different, you like implant an electrode, but it's, for example, a tetrode, which is actually made up of many different electrodes. So it just like detects from everywhere, so you want to localize it and see where the activity is actually coming from in the brain.
Yeah, and also because there are a lot of neurons that just spike generally in the brain, and it may have nothing to do with what you want to record. But there's so many different types of sorting algorithms, and which one you choose will ultimately play a really big role on how you interpret the data.
That makes a lot of sense, and maybe, again, going back to a point I mentioned earlier, everything that we do with models in science, to some extent, I believe, can be done with machine learning models. So the sorting algorithm that you use, I'm aware that there's a lot of machine learning use cases in anomaly detection. I'm not sure if that's necessary in neuroscience, but many people in industry, but also in science, use machine learning models to find particularly interesting data points, or data points that stick out, for instance, or sort data. So that's also a way that potentially machine learning might factor into scientific knowledge production, which is, I think, a big problem right now, is that we're having too much data oftentimes in science, and that's, for instance, with the Large Hadron Collider in physics, that's a huge problem. We have so much data that gets collected for every experiment, it's impossible for humans to analyze all of that. So we actually need some more or less automatic way of processing that data and filtering out, so that data gets to the human scientists in an amount that they can actually handle, right?
This is something I was thinking about in preparation for this episode, is like, do we need more data, or do we need more ways to analyze the data we already have? Because I feel like with different, as we've been discussing, different methods of analyzing the data can lead to different results, and you can pick out different commonalities or patterns in the data. It's just something I kept talking about in that same episode we recorded with Lisa, about finding patterns in all this noisy data.
Yeah.
Oh, that's an interesting point, and it might get a bit confusing with the entire terminology, but machine learning more or less emerged out of a field called pattern recognition.
Oh, okay.
And it still gets used, and to a large extent it's still a good way of thinking about machine learning. That what a lot of machine learning algorithms do, or machine learning models do, is just finding patterns in data, finding statistical regularities, finding patterns, and then using these patterns for tasks such as prediction.
Yeah, I find that so interesting.
Yeah.
And like, because a lot of neuroscience research is what is becoming more popular as well is computational modeling of how neurons work. So you'd create a model and then you'd do an experiment, but with not very much experimental data, you test to see if it fits the model. And like that's how you can firstly use fewer animals in research, and then also come up with more theoretical neuroscience by creating these models.
So this is a really good point. Maybe, so if we have machine learning models, as said, they can be used for many different purposes. But the two main purposes are either we think of the outcome of the model as the thing that we care about, so the prediction, so we use that model to predict something, or we think of the model itself as the thing that we're interested in. So we might use a machine learning model to get some understanding of the process that underlies the data generation. And so we use the model as the main outcome, and what we're interested in is some explanatory function. Now, I know someone at the University of Edinburgh has written a paper, Masvita Chirimuta, about specifically that question, which is when we now start using machine learning models instead of traditional computational models in neuroscience to model processing in the brain, because machine learning models are so complex, we might be giving up some of this like theorizing and explanatory function that these models have. Because the kind of explanatory role that computational models also might have in neuroscience, machine learning models might not have, because they're just too complex to be understood by humans.
Ooh.
Wait, so machine learning removes the theorizing process, but whereas computational models, we still require it?
I'm not sure how complex the computational models get, but maybe it's easier to just talk about theoretical models. So we might use theoretical models of some, I assume, some processing in the brain to explain to students, for instance, how it works. We can't use a machine learning model in the same sense easily, because it's just too complex.
Yeah,
Okay.
so the machine learning model is valued for its
Output.
not what it
Not the model
represents.
itself.
Yeah, not the model itself.
Right. So the tagline is we're sacrificing understanding for predictive accuracy.
Yeah.
Okay, so something else that you did mention before the episode was this divide between data and phenomena. Do you want to explain that a little bit?
I can give it a try. Yes. So there was this very seminal paper published in the Philosophy of Science in the 80s by Bogan and Woodward, who introduced more or less the divide between data and phenomena in science. And the reasoning goes is that we have data on the one hand, and that is hugely idiosyncratic. It's produced by a specific experimental procedure, and we might have a lot of data that has a lot of noise in it. And it's not really the job of a mature science to explain data anymore, but mature sciences explain phenomena instead. So to give you an example, I might, and that's the example, one of the examples being used in the paper, I might use a thermometer to measure when a certain substance melts, right? It's like lead, for instance. I place this thermometer in it, and I get a data point on, I don't know, I'm randomly guessing here, maybe 270 degrees, right? Now, I might do measurement more and more often, and I get small variations, maybe because some different airflow is happening, I'm using a different thermometer. That's data, but that's not really what scientific theories try to explain. But instead, we want to explain the melting point of lead as a theoretical phenomenon. And how that ties into machine learning is machine learning really works within the realm of data. But science often is not interested only in data, but is interested in phenomena. So how do machine learning developers account for that fact? There's a sort of gap between what a machine learning model produces and what we are ultimately often interested in scientific theorizing. Does that make sense? Or maybe you could help with an example in neuroscience between something that is data and something that is a phenomenon.
Yeah, it makes sense for sure. And this kind of ties back to what I was mentioned earlier about how we measure electrical activity, for example, from several brain regions, and then we see like, oh, there's particularly strong activity in this region when this mouse is presented with this particular visual stimuli, and then we conclude that brain activity here is responsible for perceiving vision, which is such a huge statement from just, as you said, data points, which can in themselves vary so much. And what I find particularly interesting is how much data, the data we get, relies on specific conditions in that moment in time, in that particular space. Yeah.
Exactly. And now the question is, what gets done a lot in machine learning is, oftentimes, though that's not always the case, machine learning developers aren't working in a lab, a neuroscience lab, for instance. So they oftentimes aren't really aware of all the intricate experimental setup questions that might arise, all the interpretation, all the processing that goes on, but they just get the data in the end, or get it from some repository or from some database, and then use it to make cool things with machine learning algorithms, without really knowing how much interpretation and how much, as you said, idiosyncrasy goes into producing that data in the first place.
Yeah.
So the question is, how do they contextualize the claims that they're making appropriately, and how can we help them do better?
It's interesting you say that, because looking at the electrophysiology data that we have, we can look at a trace and see whether inhibition happens or not, because there's usually a dip in the falling phase, so it hyperpolarizes a little bit. But when looking at the numbers, if we look at the amplitude and stuff, we can't really determine whether inhibition has occurred or not. And so I think
Could you not look at the negative amplitude from
yeah,
the
you
baseline?
could, but like if we were inputting the same data into the machine learning from something that doesn't have inhibition to something that does have inhibition, it would lose that contextual information, unless obviously we were careful enough to include it. But
Right, so if you were measuring the peak amplitude, you wouldn't pick up an inhibition, but if you measured the lowest point
the baseline,
below the baseline, the
yeah.
most negative value of the trace, then you
Yeah.
would pick up an inhibition. So
Yeah.
you're saying like you'd only find that if you thought maybe there might be inhibition, and then you made the model so that it would pick up on something like that.
yeah, and it's like just
Right.
if we were to paint all the data in the same like wide brushstroke, which I think perhaps can sometimes get done in machine learning, that gives to like inaccurate interpretations as well as like losing contextual information. I don't know if that's what you were referring to.
In not necessarily.
Okay.
So that for me is to a large extent also like a technical question, right?
Okay.
So I hope that, and mostly this is the case, that the machine learning developers pick data that is informative of the questions that they're trying to answer, right? But even if you include in it, the way I understand it is that you wouldn't only need one data point, but you would need like the development of that to like tell if there's some.
Yeah, you would need either like the above threshold or sub threshold data points.
And only in combination can you tell. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Only when you have like both sets of data, for example, would you be able to tell whether inhibition happened or not. But inhibition doesn't always happen.
My concern would be more with, for instance, how that data is being produced.
Ah, okay.
Yeah,
Or
so like the experimental setup
Yes,
and
sorting,
the environment.
As you
Yeah.
said, you use a sorting algorithm in some cases because you have just too much data. So I guess the sorting algorithm that gets used also has some influence in the value of the data that we have at the end. And like once all those things get done and you present them with the end result of the data, oftentimes we obscure or abstract from the entire complex process of data production that goes on, just a single numerical value.
I think, Carolina, what you mentioned is a similar but slightly separate problem of like, are we looking for the right thing in the data, right?
The point that I wanted to make when I raised that thing about the traces, and that unless you're looking at the trace, or if you don't set up the parameters for the machine learning to analyze the trace in a specific way, it can miss information.
Exactly, yeah.
As Alex mentioned, the people who develop these models may not necessarily be neuroscientists or working in neuroscience labs. So if we just rely on specific well-known models to analyze neuroscience data or analyze other type of data, it may miss contextual information.
Yeah, and maybe one thing just to mention in all of that discussion, that I think that machine learning as a discipline is making quite a lot of progress in these terms. So it might be the case that 10 years ago, a lot of the research that got published is really just super experimental of like, hey, let's try to do this cool thing with machine learning, and maybe it's of interest for someone in science. Whereas now, what gets done is really that a lot of scientists themselves are acquiring skills in machine learning, and a lot of machine learning developers are really well trained in the science that they're working in, or working closely in collaboration with scientists. So it gets a lot better, but it's still like a progress that the discipline of machine learning is going through, in my opinion, at the moment, in that people are more and more closely engaging with the science and all the difficult questions that ultimately machine learning models and developers also have to interact with.
Yeah. How much does what you want to find affect what you do find through this process of machine learning?
Yeah, that's maybe a good time, although a bit late, to introduce like that machine learning can be subdivided in different approaches. And one approach is supervised machine learning. Another one is unsupervised machine learning. There are a number of others like reinforcement learning and semi-supervised learning who aren't quite as popular. But supervised and unsupervised learning are really two main forms of machine learning, so to speak. And in unsupervised learning, we are just given data, and the model, for instance, tries to cluster data that looks similar. So we really don't know what we're finding necessarily. So we just give it data and say, hey, tell me which data points are similar. And then we can, for instance, see if we might do it with like images of animals. It might or might not give us different species as clusters, for instance. That's a very crude example, but I think it gets the point across.
Yeah.
Whereas in supervised machine learning, we have data, and we have a second data set on the thing that we're interested in. That's the example that I gave earlier of like text and the labels, whether it's more a positive or a negative review, for instance. And in that case, we're pretty much fixed on what the algorithm does. It's given this kind of data, and it tries to predict this kind of data.
Okay.
And it really doesn't do much more. Now, it might be interesting to find out how the algorithm or how the model exactly does it, but we're pretty fixed in our problem space here, if that makes sense.
Yeah. It seems like it's a really exciting time for machine learning, and that it's finally being, as you said, it's been developed in itself as a tool, and now it's starting to be developed while also being used as a tool.
Exactly.
Which is great.
It's right now that we're going from hype
Yeah.
and from excitement to actually productive.
Putting it to use.
Yes, putting it to use
Yeah.
in science. And it's a time where I think, for me as a philosopher, as an aspiring philosopher, it's really important to accompany that process and make sure that the integration of machine learning within science happens in a way that is responsible, that really moves us forward, and that doesn't sacrifice too much of what has made science great for the past hundreds of years.
Yeah.
Right?
It's so important to critically think about these new tools that we're implementing in science and how it affects the science. And as scientists, of course, it's also very exciting for us, such as like AlphaFold is an amazing tool which was developed. Was it machine learning or was it AI?
Well, that is the question.
that was.
I think it was a deep learning model, machine learning model. But again, what is machine learning is also AI, and in the end, the question is, what is AI in the first place, right?
Yeah. Well,
a topic for another episode in the future.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us, Alex. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.